Hello, and welcome to Community Voices, where we talk to Humboldt County's movers and shakers. Today's guest, David Holper, former Eureka Poet Laureate and author. And now here's your host, Paul Bressoud.
Hello and welcome to Access Humboldt Community Voices. My name is Paul Bressoud. I'm the host. Today we're speaking with David Holper, the Poet Laureate from the city of Eureka. And welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The first thing I've got to ask is, what does a Poet Laureate do?
Well, I was the inaugural Poet Laureate for 2019 to 2021. And there's a new one now. Will Gibson is the current Poet Laureate. And the way that the city set it up in coordination with the Ink people is the Poet Laureate had to propose a project. And so I proposed several projects, actually. I was very ambitious. And I guess then I had to submit some poems with that, and they must have liked it because they said yes. And so I became the Poet Laureate for a few years.
Okay, well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So is that the normal course for a Poet Laureate, to a city or a state will offer the position and then there's some sort of application process?
Yes, yeah. And I applied also at the end of my tenure for the California one. I wasn't selected, but it's quite similar to the one for Eureka.
Okay, so Eureka is asking for a Poet Laureate.
Right.
Okay, so what is Eureka looking for?
Well, I think what every city, state, and even the United States is looking for in a Poet Laureate, somebody to promote poetry, help people understand, the importance of what poetry does and its function in society, what its appeal is, and basically to popularize it and let people know who some of the poets are, probably within that community. So part of my job was not just to promote myself, but to promote the other poets and the whole poetry scene in Eureka.
So let me ask this.
Yeah.
2019 to 2021 is your tenure.
Right.
You have a pandemic in there.
Oh my gosh.
How was it trying to identify poets and promote poetry during the pandemic?
Okay, so the first thought that I had is I'll put together a big reading of a lot of poets. So I thought 20 poets. We'll do it at the Morris Graves Museum because the Rotunda is such a beautiful location to do a reading. And it was all set. And it was set for April of 2020.
Of course.
And it was canceled.
Right.
Yeah, so that was the first thing that happened. And then I had to readjust and figure out, okay, well, all the things that I wanted to do, they're gone. So several people asked me right after that, some of the poets who were involved in that, going to be part of that event, asked me, well, what are you going to do build something online? And I said, well, I don't know. And but I wound up creating a Facebook group very quickly, and lots of people flocked to that and started writing poetry about the pandemic and sharing it online. And then there were several Zoom groups that just, started up quickly, and I belong to one of them, like the Eureka Slam, which used to be at the Siren Song Tavern. It went online, and so I joined that every month. But the Facebook group, a friend of mine, Annie Fricky, started doing this thing where she would post every day. It seemed like pandemic poem number 1 and number 2. And she got up to about a dozen of them, and I thought, oh, I better start doing this. I better start writing some poetry during the pandemic so I have some record of what we went through that I can share with people later. So Annie and I started tag teaming one another, writing pandemic poems and posting them on this Facebook group. And then one day we were talking on Zoom, and she said, we should do an anthology of like a bunch of this pandemic poetry. So we put together an anthology called Voices Behind the Mask, and got 40 poets to submit poems. They're all local poets, and published that and promoted that. And we actually took a copy of it, and Cal Poly Humboldt was doing a time capsule of the pandemic, and we put it into the time capsule,
Oh, wow.
which is part of the, I guess, the historical collection now at Humboldt.
Now, how did you find the poets? Were they coming to you online? Do you know them as Poet Laureate? Are you well connected in the poetry world? Or?
Yeah, I am pretty well connected because I would go to both the Slam in Eureka and occasionally the Slam in Arcata, and I knew a lot of the poets, and I promoted writers here while I was at CR for all those years that I taught here. So I knew a lot of folks in the community. And so I reached out to some people via Facebook or email. I posted stuff on my Facebook site and emailed a bunch of people, and so word got out and people started submitting stuff.
Is that the most important aspect, you think, of the laureate's job, is to go ahead and connect the poetry community?
I think it's both to, in this sense, I think it was really important because people, as you well know, and I'm sure all the viewers who will watch this know, it was a pretty scary time, and nobody knew whether they were going to get it or not get it, or if they did get it, how bad would it be? Could you touch a surface? It was just, there was a lot of anxiety, and there was, and people were dying from it at the time, and so people were writing about all those anxieties, fears, grief, and so it was good to connect the poets, but it was also good to let the community know through the poetry what people were going through.
Was that the tone of the poetry, fear and anxiety, pretty much?
I think a lot of it was. I know my poetry definitely touched on that, the sense of the unknown. I remember writing a poem called Uncertainty early in the pandemic about how crazy things felt.
Is another aspect of the laureate, is it to become a voice of the place that they've been given the commission from?
Yes, I think it is, and one of the tasks that the Ink people in the city put into their program was to write some poems about the local area. And I remember going out, I think the first poem that I wrote was about going out to sit on the North Jetty by myself one day and just watch the waves roll in off the Pacific. But then I wrote another poem because one of the things that happened when I was selected as Poet Laureate, the California Report reached out to me and did an interview on the radio that went all over California. And they asked me about some of the things that were going on here in the community. I mentioned to them the return of Tuluwat Island to the Wiyot. And I was hoping they would do a show on it, and I wrote a poem celebrating the return of the land to the Wiyot. And then I wound up, the city was going to originally make a book of the poems that I had written during the pandemic, and they wound up changing their mind about it. I don't know what the problem was, but they decided to just do a broadside of a single poem. So I did a broadside of that poem, Tuluwat Island, and I think they printed 30 of them, and I got one of them framed, and I gave it to Ted Hernandez, who I'd shared the poem with, and I gave that frame copy to him, and it hangs in his office in their new center down in Old Town.
Oh, fantastic.
So, yeah, and Ted was great because I read him an early draft of the poem. I went out to the Wiyot site and read him the poem, and he gave me some feedback on it. And then while we were talking, I don't know how we got onto this, but he suggested, or I suggested, there should be an epigram at the start in Wiyot. And so he wound up contacting a woman who speaks and writes in Wiyot, and she wrote the epigram for it. And so on the broadside of it, you have the epigram in Wiyot.
Is that the first time you ever worked like that on a poem?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the poem, because I had gone and read the history about the genocide on Tuluwat Island, I thought I knew the events pretty well. And he said, well, there's some things that are not quite right here. And so he explained to me the history, so I went and revised the poem so that it would be accurate. So the poem both talks about the genocide, but also celebrates the return of the land to the Wiyot. And so I think, I'm really glad that I did that.
Now, you were Eureka's first poet laureate.
That's correct, yeah.
Now, it's interesting to me, you were mentioning earlier about, wouldn't they, the people that are creating the poet laureate position, keep the poems produced by the laureate and then the next laureate and then the next laureate and way down the line?
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope they're doing that.
Yeah. But you don't know that for sure.
I don't, but I'm pretty sure that Christy Patterson, who works with the Ink Lab, saved a copy of the broadside. So I'm sure they have a copy of it.
Wow. So California was the first state to
Yes.
have a poet laureate over 100 years ago.
Right.
And 1919, I think, was the first, actually the 100th anniversary when you got your poet laureate. And
Isn't
you
that ironic?
say that, I was looking at poet laureates, that cities
All over
also,
the country.
all over the country.
Yeah.
It seemed like more of a state event, but
No. It's everywhere now. In fact, I went out to the writers' retreat at the Mattole this summer for the first time, and I met a woman, Kimi Subiaka, who's the poet laureate for Alameda. And we were just joking with one another because she was going to be in the 4th of July parade down there in Alameda and hand out little poems that she had put on a piece of paper. And I said, well, are you going to have a limo or something you're riding up on, the convertible, you're sitting on the back? She goes, no, a friend of mine's a lawyer, he's going to be driving his Toyota Prius.
There you go.
Yeah.
So how many cities in California have poet laureates?
Oh, I couldn't say, but a number of them do.
I know the
know
person from the Alameda, the only one you've connected with?
No, I've met a former poet laureate from San Francisco, Kim Shuck. She and I are planning to do a reading in San Francisco sometime in the near future. So they're all over the place. I think there's one for Santa Cruz. I'm sure there's one for LA and San Diego. All the big cities seem to have them now.
Is Eureka among the smaller cities is it the smallest city that has a poet laureate?
I don't know. I don't know the scope of all the poet laureates for California, but I know when the city council was looking at putting this program together, they reached out to me and had me look at their proposal, and I read it over and made a few suggestions to them. And when I emailed it back, I kind of was hesitant about it, but I said, can I apply? Is it okay now that I've commented on it?
It's an inside job.
I don't want to feel like this is tainted, but I'm interested.
Now that I've groomed this for myself,
yes.
Can I apply as well?
Yeah, but I did, at the time, I looked up some of the other cities in California, and San Francisco, I think, was one of them. And I can't remember the other one, maybe Sacramento. And I found the poet laureate programs and the applications for them. So I looked over what the qualifications were and what the poet laureate had to do during his or her tenure. And so I was familiar with it, and I made some suggestions to the city in that regard.
Demographic question.
Yeah.
Do we have a high poets per capita population in Humboldt County?
I think we do. I'll just say I lived in Sacramento for 10 years, and I taught high school and part-time community college. And, not to knock Sacramento, but Sacramento did seem a little bit of a cultural wasteland to me at the time. It was a long time ago, but it just wasn't the vibrancy of the art scene that you see here in Eureka. There is a lot of painting, sculpture, poetry, music. It's very rich, and it was really refreshing to move here and start working at CR because of that. So I've really enjoyed how many writers there are here, and just how generous in spirit they are, and experimental. It's great. It's a great scene.
Now, you say you go out to these slams and participate, but do you have favorite poets that are kind of coming up and you're watching them, or you like their stuff?
Yeah, it's amazing the people who come to the slams. I really miss the one in Eureka when the Siren Song changed hands. It was there briefly, and then it basically gravitated into people's backyards, and it did that for about a year, and then it finally moved into my house, and now there's maybe 10 of us left from what used to be a night where 50 or 60 people would show.
50 or 60?
Yeah.
50 or 60 people reading poems?
Yeah. Well,
Wow.
The audience. So maybe, 15 or 20 people who were the poets who were reading and performing.
That's still a huge number.
Yeah, I remember I had, when my second book came out, I did a book release party through the Siren Song, and there were 100 people in the room easily.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crowded. And I used
And
to...
it's a great turnout for poetry.
Yeah, and I used to do this thing when I taught creative writing here at College of the Redwoods, where when my poetry class would finish, I'd have everybody polish one poem, practice reciting it, and we'd do a reading at the Morris Graves. And we did that for, I think, about 5 years. We'd do it every spring semester, and we would regularly turn out 100 or more people for that event. So, people are, it's surprising for a small community, but there's a lot of interest in poetry.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So a great place to be a laureate from.
Oh, yeah, and a great place to help people who are in the community where you say, well, I'm a poet, and they say, what does a poet do? And then, I can bring out a poem and share it with them, and they oftentimes then connect it, and they see the use of it, or they understand it. But it's the kind of thing where I don't know that people, the average person digests a poem every day or reads a poem every day. But when emotional...
Wait.
Yeah.
The average person reads a poem every day?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'd say the average person doesn't read a poem every day.
Okay,
but when somebody dies in your family, or somebody dies who's close to you, or you go through some sort of trauma, whatever that would be, that's the time when poetry plays a significant role. And that's the time when people get poems out and start looking for a poem to read at a wedding, to read at a funeral. Because poetry, as Billy Collins, who was the Poet Laureate of the United States, once said, is the emotional history of the world, of humanity. And we need that in times like that. So, I think poetry plays an important role.
Do you think, that being said, do you think fun poetry that's not associated with a grieving event or a ceremony, just like the slams must have been? I mean, is there room for fun poetry?
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up, and my dad had a few copies of Ogden Nash books around the house, and I loved that. And then later, I bumped into Shel Silverstein.
Sure.
And then, while I was teaching poetry here at CR, some students of mine introduced me to Billy Collins, and I started reading Billy Collins, who's just hilarious. And I remember the group from that creative writing class went to go see him perform at then Humboldt State University. And he was so hilarious. I remember my sides ached after that reading was over. I had laughed so hard.
Wow.
It just,
fantastic.
And then I saw Taylor Mawley read at the advanced placement literature exam scoring that was taking place, I think, in Louisville at the time. And I so enjoyed him. I invited him to come read here at CR.
He didn't read when the people were grading.
No, this was
at night.
But they would always invite a writer during the scoring session.
Really?
Yeah, always, every year. And so
I've heard horror stories about those grading sessions.
Oh, I did it for years and years. I did it for over 20 years.
Really?
Yeah. And so they would always invite a writer, and that year they invited Taylor Mawley, and I was so impressed with his work. I invited him to come read here at CR. So I don't know, maybe 10 years ago he came and read here at CR. And he was fabulous. And quite funny.
And quite funny?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that if you expand out the places where poetry can be heard, then you're going to expand your audience. Did you bring some poems to read or something?
I did, yeah.
Okay, well, there you go.
So this book is called Language Lessons, a Linguistic Hijira, and it came out of teaching creative writing because I was always looking for interesting exercises for the poets to write from, prompts to get them going on an interesting poem. And somehow, and I'm not exactly sure where I first saw this, but people started gathering these untranslatable words from other languages, and they were so intriguing. Like there's a German word I remember stumbling into, Backpfeffengesicht, which means a face in need of a fist. And I thought, that's a hilarious word. And so what I would do...
It's an hilarious concept.
It is, yeah, and we don't have something quite like that in English, not a single word that expresses that. And so as I began to find these words, I would gather them, and I had a sheet of them, and then I would cut the sheet up into strips, and I would give, I would have the students draw a word from a basket, and then I would tell them, okay, you have 10 minutes to write on this particular word. So they'd know the word, the language, what part of speech it was, and what its definition was.
They know the definition.
Yeah, and then they'd have to write a poem about it. So this book is made entirely of these untranslatable words.
Are these student poems?
No, these are poems that, because I would always write along with them, and so I started to gather up my best efforts. So let me see. Do you want a serious one or a funny one to begin with?
I think, it's your artistic license. You're
Okay.
opening your show.
Yeah.
You have an audience out here. What do you want to start with?
Okay, well, this is the first poem in the collection, and it's Greek. It's a noun, and the word is metanoia. It's the journey of transforming your mind, your heart, yourself, or way of life.
Wow.
And the idea behind the collection was it was sort of a spiritual journey through language. So here we go. The plane ticket, the shuttle, the train ride, the taxi, even the first step onto the gravel, into the dirt, the dust, your boots whispering against the dry grass. These are just dust motes dancing over the surface. The real journey calls you deeper into the soul's secret country, where all such journeys must lead you beyond expectations, beyond these hazy dreamings, if you are finally to set right what you have long known was broken from the beginning. So that's the first one in the collection, metanoia. Okay, let me give you a different one. This is a word probably a lot of people are familiar with if you know any French or you know any French history. The word is flâner. It's a French, it's a verb. It's described as one of the most Parisian of all French words. It was defined in the 19th century by the Paris literary crowd. It refers to the art of leisurely strolling the streets of Paris, or any city for that matter, without any goal or destination, simply for the pleasure of soaking up the city's beauty. So this is an experience my wife and I had years ago in Russia. In St. Petersburg one summer long ago, the sun was damned if it would set, so we walked most of the night. We sauntered past cathedrals and cemeteries, shuttered shop windows and curtained apartments. Ghostly, we drifted along in the pale summer air. Sometimes we glided past the other insomniacs, looking for what? Not one of us could say. It was only a pleasure found in our feet, with sleep on holiday, and walking, the only way to while away the beauty of those magical hours. Yeah, that midnight sun, it stayed up forever. Well, let me...
I hitchhiked to Alaska when I was 19.
Oh, so you know.
Yeah.
You know. Let me find you a funny one. There's a bunch of...
So you've taken the word, and then from the word's definition, then you've gone ahead and created the poem.
Yeah, right.
Okay, right.
And so and the idea for the students was that they could, in some way, illuminate what the word was about. And the poem would help us to better understand it. So this is an Italian word, it's a noun, it's gattara. It's an elderly woman who cares for stray cats. You know the story. In the news, they are reporting that when the old lady died, they found 100 cats in her house, all well fed, strays, every one, living in the lap of luxury. Don't be jealous if in her will she left her millions to the mangy lot of them. Perhaps you were a stray once too, and understand what it is to be picked up by the scruff and saved.
That could have been for the Eureka Laureate too.
Totally. Yeah. So how about another one?
One more.
Okay,
Let's
one
go
more.
One more. We're going to be wrapping it up pretty quick.
Sounds good. So this is a Spanish word. It's an adjective. It's friolero. It's someone sensitive to the cold. So a friolero or persona friolera is someone who feels cold when a normal person wouldn't, or just doesn't feel good when it's cold. Perhaps you've seen one, waddling down the street like some shaggy mastodon, every square inch covered in coat, scarf, hat, gloves, eyes, 2 tiny slits that peek out as if they had just arrived at the North Pole in the dead of winter.
There you go.
Yeah.
So, as we come to an end here, what does an ex-laureate do now? I mean,
I still write poetry. Now that I'm retired, I'm starting to work on novels. But I still write poetry, still publishing poetry. Right now, I'll put a little plug in on November the 17th. I'm part of Humboldt Arts Council, and we're inviting the Poet Laureate for the state of California, a guy named Lee Herrick, is going to come give a reading at the Morris Graves Museum.
On November 17th?
On November 17th, yeah.
The Poet Laureate for the state of California is coming to Eureka.
Yeah, and it's ironic how it came about, because he posted his touring schedule on Facebook, and I happen to be following him on Facebook, and I saw that the farthest north he had gone, or was going to go on his tour, was San Francisco. And I made a snarky comment on his Facebook feed. I said, how about coming to Northern California?
Right.
And he said, where are you? And I said, in Eureka. He said, would you like me to come? I said, absolutely. So he's going to make good on his promise. He's coming to read in Eureka.
Well, that's a great way to wrap things up. And specifics, November 17th, at what time? Right.
So Lee Herrick, the California Poet Laureate, is going to be doing a reading at the Morris Graves at 7 o'clock in the evening. There is a suggested donation to attend. And I assume he's going to read for about an hour. So it should be a fabulous event.
Fantastic. Is that the first time the state Poet Laureate has been in Eureka?
Well, I think Dana Gioia came, a friend of mine, invited him, but it was a relatively small reading and it wasn't all that well publicized. So I think this is going to be a little better because it's a bigger venue and I'm making an effort to make sure that everybody in the community knows. So if you're interested at all, I definitely come out. It's a rare event when a Poet Laureate from the state of California comes to Eureka. So
fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us. Appreciate having you.
Paul.
Thank you for reading.
Yeah.
We get a chance to ask you about your circumnavigation of Mount Tampayas. We'll have to save that
for
another time.
Yeah.
So, for Community Voices, thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us on Community Voices. If you represent a nonprofit that is interested in being a guest on Community Voices, email info@accesshumboldt.net. Access Humboldt, local voices through community media.